So I try to go along with what seems to be lingering in my mind at times. If it seems significant, if it just continues to be something as I involve myself throughout the day doing various tasks and various ideas just keep surfacing, then eventually, especially in the quiet of the evening, I try to examine what those ideas are. And more often than not, when something does keep occurring along those lines and I just try to brush it off, then eventually I find it ends up being important that I had reflected on it and talked through it and whatnot. And so I'm having another one of those things happening, and it's just kind of on the surface level, so I kind of have to mentally unpack it. And what it seems like is, since I had put in my 2 cents about some of these other strategic maneuvers going on behind the scenes, and a sense of what else seems to be happening in terms of maybe what you would like loosely call some of the world powers or something along those lines, various power players. And I had talked about concerns with this whole gridlock of things where we don't really have yet someone that's ultimately entirely doing the right thing. We're all caught up in this this whole web of interactions and responses that are not always the most ideal, that force our hand and cause the world to be embroiled in all of these things. And so along those lines, then there's going to be a sense where people are not going to agree with certain portions and strategies, right? And so I'd kind of loosely said some things that were lingering in my mind that did seem a little far-fetched. And so I kind of said, well, maybe in an alternative universe and stuff like that. And so little unpacking that I'm just kind of feeling lingering to do with. And here's the thing, I'm not trying to say that I'm some expert on all of this. I'm just kind of talking through stuff personally. And so there still needs to be other people's input and expertise and refining ideas and questioning through it and whatnot. But to kind of unpack a little further, the idea and the concerns that were referenced pertaining to the establishment Democrats. It's difficult to say that. It's difficult to speak in such generalized terms because nothing fully encapsulates a whole movement. There's all these different moving parts where there's portions to preserve within all different camps. There's stuff that we don't want to entirely be rid of. And then there's certain reasonings as to why people do certain things that they do, or what they're vying for, fighting for, leveraging for, and things along those lines. And so for me, I don't really, at this point in time and seeing all the different things intertwined, I can't really label myself entirely left or right. And I don't look at it as, and I don't say that in some type of like wishy-washy way. There just really are legitimate things that there's portions within the establishment Democrats that I would agree with, and I understand why they need to have certain leverage on the world stage and hold the gridlock of their position. And there's certain things, within the Republican Party that are similar. And then also with maybe the more centered groups, whether it be like, maybe you would say like progressives or like various liberal stances. And then you have like in the Republican Party, various different ones that have slight deviations from maybe what you would call the establishment Republicans or libertarians or what have you. Anyway. And so at some level, it just kind of all functions as this gridlocked unit where I do agree we do need some levels of safety in terms of security and managing the borders, but we also need to do it with sake of humanity and a level of ethics and due process and basically not misusing the law to weaponize against certain people or to act as some sort of terrorizing against their own citizens or even other citizens. There just needs to be a level of universal human rights and, along those lines, right? But to have a functioning, political entity, there does need to be some level of cohesiveness and abiding within the law and certain expectations for a functional society, right? But I also agree that there is a type of, even if useful at times, a certain religious standard that tends to function within the Republican Party and doesn't always offer certain rights that, don't seem to fit within those certain ideologies. And so then there's areas where I disagree on the interpretation. I don't think that, so this is where I'll also find some maybe religious Democrats that are more open to some of those things, and just across the spectrum, difference of opinion in how people interpret religion, but also how people interpret things within the stage of progress where we're at situationally and stuff like that, as though I kind of approach the world as not yet ideal. And so you almost have to approach the world as you still have this future vision, but you almost have to negotiate as though it almost is like a hostage situation a little bit. All the key players, you have to make sure there's a level of progress and whatnot. Meeting people to some degree where they're at, but still not saying that we're giving up on this farther continual refining of freedoms. And there's just a lot more that can go on with that. So anyway, I was finding myself, since I've talked about some of these issues where we are kind of in a peculiar place. I could say more, but it's just hard to speak in generalities. So I'm kind of speaking vaguely about it in terms of we're kind of in what it seems like is in this peculiar position where there are certain ones that would, how do you say that? Because of the situation, we find ourselves at this kind of turning point with Israel on the world stage and its administration and the differing of its vision, even amongst other Israel groups and Jewish people globally and whatnot. There's just this precarious time that we're at. And so I talked about that. I talked about this situation in reference to also just not knowing that the establishment Democrat Party would handle that in a way where there would actually be a shift, even though there are certain things within the Democratic Party that I agree with in some areas, and then some that I don't. And so I'm finding myself going back now. This is a long introduction to what I'm trying to say. The main theme that I'm lingering with is trying to unpack a little bit more of the Democratic Party side, because I tend to be Democratic leaning in terms of how to develop a cohesive society and things to help build stability and access and all of those other things. I'm generally just not against those. What becomes peculiar, though, is that on the world stage, we've had other things intertwine and attach itself to our political systems and connections and covert methods and other things that are basically kind of undermining what those ideals could be. And so maybe what I'm trying to say is it seems like some other groups seem to recognize that and are interpreting it as the level of threat that it is. Whereas it didn't seem like at the time the Democrat establishment wasn't recognizing that, nor seeing it as the level of threat. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling. So let me just try to say more simply what it is. I do think that there are certain ones that we would probably categorize as left-leaning, even globally, where there really are legitimate things that they're vying for and preserving and refusing to let go of. And I think that that's necessary, especially when we're trying to shift things kind of holistically. We kind of need that pressure point. And I tend to think that a lot of those things I agree with. And so I'm kind of waiting for almost like the breaking point so we can get to those points. So I don't want to, so it's almost like if I were shifting a puzzle, I definitely would want to keep that piece. It's kind of like a chunk that, when you have such a massive puzzle you're trying to put together, it's such a piece that I'd want to preserve and keep together, but it's like not ready yet to incorporate because we have this other thing happening. And I guess that's a little bit as how I see it is, I'm not looking at this as like all or nothing. And we also kind of recognize that other groups are misusing other efforts, like peace efforts that we're trying to have on the world stage with others. So it's just this whole web of things. Along those lines, then, I just kind of had this concern of feeling like we don't want to, how do we say that? We don't want to undermine or lose those gains. But what we're finding is this tipping point of things on the world stage, the shifting of the power struggle needed to be recognized at a level that it wasn't, because there was this certain trajectory of keeping things going in the way that it was, especially in relation to the role that Israel was playing. Along those lines, I think what I'm trying to say is there just felt to be this need to say that we recognize and try to discern between that, where we really can't generalize certain ones as, like enemies to this whole strategy of things that's kind of being worked through. As an example, even though in the ideal sense, ultimately in the grand scheme of things, farther reaching, thinking farther ahead, we want to cohesively de-escalate the world powers, those in those power seats. But at the time where we need different powers to counteract other powers, we have to strategize it in a way where we don't leave an improper power ultimately residing over the world in a too much of a vulnerable, slanted, skewed way against other nations and whatnot. We also don't want to neglect the groups where we know that they were improperly pinned against or like used as pawns, and we can kind of see how, like in the grand scheme of things, and we can kind of see how there's a need to differentiate some of those things. And as an example, so some of that looks like differentiating some stuff with, say as an example, like Ukraine, or differentiating stuff internally with Israel. And what we're starting to find is we've kind of looked at things in general, like the world powers and the general representation, whether it be Netanyahu and his administration on the world stage. And then there's these things under the surface and behind the scenes where we're finding where other groups and other leaders maybe needed some to be emboldened or to have some assistance because they were trying to counteract what Netanyahu was doing, or various ones. And so looking at those things as to is how do we view some of those efforts, and like not just looking at it in generalization, and also looking at the differences, say like with Ukraine, and looking at the there's just so much nuance to work through. For instance, like the intentions, possibly, I'm just speaking loosely, I'm just kind of giving a general idea, with like say maybe like France support and its support for Ukraine and whatnot, and also looking before at how I believe it was France and various others, and some various entities within the UK and in general that were in support of Palestine and justice and and advocating for Gaza, and we're open to that. And so trying to support alleviating the continuous pressures on Ukraine. And so I just don't see all of these different groups in the same camp. I could see how, I mean, it almost does seem, and maybe this is an oversimplification, it almost does seem though like a country's openness to support for Gaza and Palestinians really seemed like an indicator as to their openness to negotiate improvements among world powers and international trade and all of these things and whatnot. And I think it seems, hesitant to talk about this in such generally simplified terms, but I guess I'll just try to articulate it. Ukraine seems just put in such a peculiar situation within all of this gridlock, where the certain power trajectory, the world powers, so if we're trying to solve for alleviating this, like the certain power trajectory had a certain direction it was going in terms of solving for the way that people would look at Israel in relation to, and this was like the establishment on the left and the right, the Republicans and the Democrats. But the Democrats weren't necessarily going to make it into like a religious interpretation. They were calling it, instead of, so in the Republican Party, they were kind of calling it something along the lines of like Western development. But it was basically hand in hand with the religious interpretation of and for favoring certain alliances with Israel. And so along these lines, they were kind of having this package deal where they were going to, what it seemed like, like I keep saying in just generalized terms, what it seemed like generally NATO countries or certain alliances with like this westernized world, right? We're going to put pressure on what seemed to be this building up of like a counter resistance to this that was pressuring Ukraine against, or using it as pressure against Russia, and Russia potentially talking with China, potentially talking with Iran, et cetera, et cetera. What was peculiar at that time is that people seemed so sure that that was the thing that needed to be done, that was the direction to preserve this, a certain type of civilization or westernized dominance and whatnot. And here's the thing, I'm not really framing things as being anti-West or anti-civilization. I just think that entire approach is just a wrong way to view the interconnectedness of world nations and whatnot. But that's just, in reference to some of the terminology used. What you seem to be finding is that people were using certain types of intelligence or other things to undermine anybody that would kind of cross those lines or cross those divisions. And so then you would have various groups. I'm feeling hesitant because now I'm like, how am I going to try to articulate this without unpacking all of these things? So I kind of feel this little this is too much to try to say. So almost as though, I guess just to cut to the chase, I think it's incorrect the way that some of these pressures have been waged against certain countries, whether, even if they're deemed like anti to Western development or whatnot. We continue to see a certain type of, I guess you would say, liberalization waged against other countries and propagandized as these countries are authoritarian and whatnot. And what seems to be wrong about it is that usually it seems like that's always the talking points of a colonial type approach among nations. And so for me, when I see that, I just feel like it's backwards. Even though there's areas where groups can learn a type of proper assimilation or cohesiveness, there usually is the initial stage of proper negotiation with the protective defense or preservation of certain other nations. And so then once you have those proper connections, then you have later what seems to follow is like the liberalization or what have you, the loosening up of certain approaches and whatnot. But when you try to do that the other way around, it just like magnifies a level of defense. And so it fortifies other groups in their protective measure. Just seems like you hear the similar rhetoric of expansion where it's like, well, we can't give an inch at all, or we'll make ourselves vulnerable, but that just doesn't seem correct. It seems as though you make yourself more vulnerable when you don't create connections in areas where you already can, whether it be areas of trade or whatnot, creating that network and then developing that relationship and then hoping for eventual liberalization and whatnot. And so then what we're finding instead is this propaganda that is waged against other nations as to being used to undermine them. And for me, I just don't see that that's correct. That doesn't mean that I justify all of these things. Like I said, I'm just going to try to keep in simple terms instead of going into all the little details. So I generally think that way. I generally think that there's more benefit in not going in and trying to take over, undermine other nations, and finding areas where we can create and increase the network of trade amongst other negotiations and whatnot. I think along those lines, it kind of seems like some of the support that Ukraine is getting from some entities, whether it be France or some groups like in the UK and various ones, is kind of serving as preserving some of the benefit that should still be there in reference to Ukraine and whatnot. And so I think it's useful, and I think that I'm not against that. I'm not really opposed to that. I ultimately would like to see a better cohesiveness. I don't think that it even had to be pushed to that point, but I think it was a intentional provocation, and ultimately it was enacted within the trajectory of a westernized expansion that was wanting to preserve a one-sided expansion and refuse a proper breakthrough of negotiation internationally and whatnot. I don't think Ukraine was doing that. I think it was used as that position on the world stage. And so in itself, there's this there is something legitimate about Ukraine wanting to preserve a portion of what should be preserved about it. That isn't, it's a mess, because once it breaks into the conflict, then there's all of these other aspects of things that had occurred. But what I also think is to differentiate, there also seemed intermixed in a lot of what was being propagandized with like Russia, Ukraine, and some of these other movements had been be categorized as some groups within westernized countries propagandizing and destabilizing with various movements and whatnot. What's tricky about this is that some of the movements are legitimate. There really are areas where, and so this is also where I think groups generalize some of the activism and whatnot too. And so there's even a need to differentiate the activism where there is legitimate aspects of, there is a level of activism that is preserving what should be basic human rights and freedoms of, like, once we get past these like major conflicts of the powers and have a level of defense and preservation and whatnot. And then there's a difference in some activist groups infiltrating activism as a guise to kind of cloak themselves within intentions and actions that, if left on their own, would not develop healthy societies, would not create stabilizing societies, nor would result in societies that flourish with any kinds of freedom or eventual liberalization. and are just very much weaponized and infiltrating these other movements. So there's all these layers of these things, right? I guess I'm just attempting to say this because just a need to differentiate. So I guess if I try to summarize, there's a lot of things within the establishment Democrats that I believe in terms of good core principles for building domestically to give ourselves more freedom and to remedy historical harms internally, domestically. For them to preserve those, though, in the way that they have been made to have to deal with it on the world stage, internationally, geopolitically, that's where I disagree with, because they tend to have to, in some ways, maybe if you asked certain ones within the Democratic Establishment Party, they might say, well, if I could change it, I would, but we have to do this so we could preserve these. Because it almost seems like, if you're looking at it through like the better intentions, the Democratic Establishment Party seems to be selecting for what can help them establish the benefits domestically. And I tend to agree with that. Whereas with, some of those ideals and whatnot, but where they're not really doing the work to change what's required to get those benefits geopolitically, that's where I disagree, where they just kind of toe the line and go with the trajectory of like geopolitical world dominance and expansion, and use the same language and rhetoric that they try to correct for domestically with us, but they use it against other nations. So that's where I disagree, because the expansionism doesn't really change its tactics. And so what we're finding then is that's kind of how I see with like the Democratic Party. What I see with like kind of liberal activism and whatnot is there are areas that are how would you say it, like speaking a truth in terms of preserving what should be certain rights and resisting where there's encroachment on them, where they're being improperly generalized with other activism groups that have infiltrated and are just kind of tearing societies apart and whatnot, and don't have a vision or attributes or practices that would build more freedoms for people. So that's what I'm talking about in reference there. And what I'm kind of gauging is this precarious place, if we're looking at the establishment Republicans, is that there could be a benefit to shift this if they are starting to look at Israel differently and needing to transform that relation there. And then what I'm also seeing there is them looking at not just generalizing all of Israel, and possibly looking at what other groups had also had concerns and were trying to raise the alarm at concerns within Israel, and were being like silenced, and would have, if they could have that support, would have been more of a change agent internally for Israel as well. And also, as I was saying, looking at just some, maybe like along the lines of libertarianism or just some of the other kind of more middle ground conservatives, I do tend to think there is this practical approach to just certain safety measures and preserving the ability for those that have done the work to develop a cohesive, functioning society, to have some of those developments and those gains honored. And so there's just all these different players, right, where we're not trying to destroy all of society. We're trying to keep the gains. We're trying to have a reflection of what building and developing this cohesive society is. We're trying to differentiate between those that are ultimately on a trajectory of causing harm and destruction, and those that have all of these different intertwined attributes for things we need to preserve. So ultimately, when we kind of get past this shift, we can have a better, cohesive, functioning society, global, international relations and whatnot. Yes, like if somebody were to ask me, say like a liberal contributor or something, and they said, well, do you agree with some of these things, A, B, C, and D? And I'd say, yes, I do. Like, I do think at least that's a direction to go, to ask those questions, to develop and repair domestically some of the issues and struggles that we have and whatnot. And then they might say, well, why does it seem like you're not just wholeheartedly going in this direction and whatnot. And so then I think that's what I'm trying to say is I would like to, but I feel like there's these hurdles that we have to like legitimately address where world powers are shifting on the world stage right now. And so we have to like legitimately weigh our options with those, or we don't then get the like the secondary result of the liberalization of it. And so it's as though I am agreeing with those things, but I guess I'm just disagreeing with the steps to get there. And the other things that are problematic or like harmful that are like intertwined into those deals that are existing to preserve some of these other factors that we need shifted and changed. What I mean by that is we're finding that what keeps some of the world powers going in the way that it's going and keeps it in gridlock and is preventing a shift of change is some of these covert methods that are functioning as trying to build and develop societies, but are directly undermining societies and appearing and infiltrating within other movements and whatnot. And so it's just creating all of this shifting of deception that is infiltrating the market, stacking the alliances, and producing improper powers and the gridlock of the world powers, and propagandizing it in such a way that's actually preventing a proper breakthrough and preventing a healthier market. And then, so it's just some of those things that I'm just considering and thinking about where I think it's just recognizing concerns and how to like get there. And so I am wanting to get there. I actually do believe we can get to where we look at religion. Like I'm not intending to ultimately keep or preserve the way that religion in relation to understanding world powers and all of these things is presently at in the stage that it's at. And even by definition, it seems like when people are defining something in relation to gridlock, you would expect that when there's a breakthrough, it would also require a shift in how you think. And so I am expecting that. I'm not saying it's going to be the same as it is now, and we're expecting it to shift and then develop into this like better way to exist on the world stage and whatnot. And so that's why I'm just kind of focusing on the strategizing, looking at like the powers, you know, and it's a precarious time, so it's not 100% sure how it's going to go. And so just kind of gauging the tides here a little bit. And anyway, I hope that somewhat clarified and articulated a little bit. I think to not overly try to clarify and get confused here, I'll just kind of leave it at that. I do feel like I did recognize what was kind of stirring within me, and it does feel like I'm more at ease. Is like, okay, I kind of said what I worked through what I was like ruminating over. But yeah, I'm not sure if that is clarifying, but anyway, that's just another one of my audio journals.